November 8, 1935, 10:23 a.m. Manhattan Criminal Court, Courtroom 4B. Two bailiffs grabbed Stephanie St. Clair by the arms, trying to physically remove her from the defendant's table. She was laughing. Not crying, not screaming, laughing in the face of Judge Walter Hoffman, who'd just sentenced her to 2 years in prison for operating an illegal numbers racket. "You think this is funny, Miss St. Clair?" Judge Hoffman's face was red with rage. "You think mocking this court is amusing?" Stephanie stopped struggling against the bailiffs for just a moment, looked the judge dead in the eyes and said, "I think it's hilarious that you're sending me to prison while the white mobsters who run 10 times my operation walk free. Yes, Your Honor, I find that very funny." The courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled frantically. The prosecutor, a smug man named Charles Patterson, smiled like he'd just won the lottery. And the bailiffs started dragging Stephanie toward the door, her laughter echoing off the marble walls. That's when it happened. A man stood up in the back of the courtroom, 6'1", impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey suit, his presence so commanding that every head turned. Bumpy Johnson. The courtroom went silent. Even the bailiffs stopped dragging Stephanie. Even Judge Hoffman stopped shouting. Because everyone in that room knew what Bumpy Johnson standing up meant. It meant the game was about to change. "Your Honor," Bumpy said, his voice calm and measured, "I'd like to address the court." Judge Hoffman's hands gripped his gavel so hard his knuckles turned white. "Mr. Johnson, you are not a party to these proceedings. Sit down or I'll have you removed." Bumpy didn't sit down, he didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "I have information pertinent to this case. Information about witness tampering, evidence fabrication, and judicial corruption. I can share it here publicly for all these reporters to hear, or I can share it privately in your chambers. Your choice, Your Honor." The silence that followed was deafening. Prosecutor Patterson jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is absurd. Mr. Johnson is obviously attempting to intimidate this court." "Intimidate?" Bumpy smiled. "I'm simply offering information. Unless there's a reason you don't want certain facts to come to light, Mr. Patterson." Judge Hoffman's face had gone from red to pale. His eyes darted between Bumpy, the reporters, and Stephanie, who'd stopped laughing and was now watching with intense curiosity. "Bailiffs, release Miss St. Clair. Everyone else, clear this courtroom. Now." What nobody in that room understood, what the reporters wouldn't discover until years later, was that Bumpy Johnson had spent the last 3 weeks building a case that would expose the entire corrupt system that had targeted Stephanie St. Clair. And what he revealed in Judge Hoffman's chambers over the next 40 minutes wouldn't just free Stephanie, it would destroy careers, expose the ugly alliance between the courts and the mob, and prove once again why Bumpy Johnson was the most dangerous man in Harlem. To understand what happened in that courtroom, you need to understand the relationship between Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson. They weren't lovers, though rumors always suggested it. They were something more important. They were partners in the truest sense. Allies who understood that protecting Harlem meant protecting each other. Stephanie, Madam Queen, had built the numbers racket in Harlem from nothing. By 1935, she was pulling in $200,000 a year. She employed hundreds of runners, paid her people well, and kept the money in the community. She was brilliant, fearless, and absolutely unwilling to bow to anyone, especially the white mob. Bumpy Johnson had come up through the ranks differently. He'd worked for Stephanie in the early 30s, learned the business, then branched out into other operations. By 1935, he was her equal in power and influence. But unlike Stephanie, who fought the system head-on, Bumpy worked in the shadows. He understood that real power wasn't about making noise. It was about knowing secrets that other people wanted to keep hidden. The case against Stephanie had been building for 18 months. It started when Dutch Schultz, the white mobster who controlled most of Manhattan's illegal operations, decided he wanted Harlem's numbers racket. The problem was Stephanie St. Clair. She refused to sell, refused to partner, refused to step aside. Dutch tried intimidation. Stephanie laughed in his face. He tried sending enforcers. She sent them back bleeding. He tried undercutting her prices. She had too much loyalty built up. The community stood with her. So Dutch did what powerful white men always did when they couldn't beat someone legitimately. He used the system. He went to the police, specifically to Captain Edward Murphy, the commanding officer of the 32nd Precinct, which covered most of Harlem. "I want Stephanie Saint. Clair arrested, tried and imprisoned," Dutch said, sliding an envelope with $10,000 across Murphy's desk. "I don't care what it takes. Make it happen." Murphy knew Stephanie was untouchable through normal means. She paid her protection money, had politicians in her pocket, and ran a tight operation that left no evidence. So Murphy did something different. He fabricated evidence. 3 months before the trial, Murphy's officers raided one of Stephanie's alleged collection points, a barbershop on 135th Street. They claimed they found betting slips, cash, and ledgers documenting the entire operation. Stephanie knew immediately it was fake. She'd never kept records in that barbershop. She wasn't that careless. But Murphy had planted everything perfectly. He even had 2 witnesses, both small-time criminals he'd arrested on other charges, ready to testify that they'd placed bets with Stephanie's runners at that exact location. The trial was a setup from the beginning. Judge Walter Hoffman was known for being tough on black defendants and lenient on white ones. Prosecutor Charles Patterson was a rising star in the DA's office, ambitious and ruthless. And the jury, all 12 members, were white. Not a single black person. Stephanie's lawyer, a man named David Rothstein, tried to fight it. He filed motions to suppress the evidence, claiming illegal search and seizure. Denied. He tried to get a change of venue. Denied. He tried to get black jurors included in the pool. Denied. The trial lasted 4 days. The prosecution paraded witness after witness, all of them lying, all of them paid off by either Dutch Schultz or Captain Murphy. They showed the jury the betting slips, the ledgers, the cash. They painted Stephanie as a criminal mastermind, exploiting poor black people for profit. Stephanie tried to defend herself. She took the stand and told the truth. "I run a numbers operation, yes, but so do 50 white men in this city, and none of them are sitting in this courtroom. The only difference between me and them is that I'm black and I'm a woman." Patterson cross-examined her viciously. "So, you admit you're a criminal?" "I admit I provide a service people want, just like the stock market, just like the lottery. The only difference is who gets to call it legal." "The difference, Miss St. Clair, is that you break the law." "The law that's enforced selectively against people who look like me? Yes, I break that law, every single day." The jury deliberated for 90 minutes, guilty on all charges. Judge Hoffman sentenced her immediately. 2 years in Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women, the maximum sentence allowed under the statute. That's when Stephanie started laughing. Not because she thought it was funny, but because the absurdity of it all, the corruption, the racism, the injustice, was so overwhelming that laughing was the only response that made sense. "You're sending me to prison while Dutch Schultz operates freely," she said, still laughing. "You're calling me a criminal while the real criminals wear badges and black robes?" Judge Hoffman banged his gavel. "Remove her from my courtroom." The bailiffs grabbed her. She didn't resist, just kept laughing, that defiant sound echoing through the courtroom. And that's when Bumpy stood up. Bumpy had been in that courtroom every single day of the trial, sitting in the back, watching, listening, taking mental notes. He'd seen the fake witnesses. He'd recognized the planted evidence. He'd understood immediately that this wasn't about justice. It was about Dutch Schultz removing his competition, using the legal system as a weapon. So Bumpy had spent those 4 days of trial doing his own investigation. He'd sent his people to talk to Murphy's officers. He'd tracked down the 2 witnesses who testified against Stephanie. He'd followed the money trail from Dutch Schultz to Captain Murphy to Judge Hoffman's campaign fund. And he'd documented everything. When Bumpy said he had information about witness tampering and judicial corruption, he wasn't bluffing. He had names, dates, amounts, conversations. He had everything he needed to destroy everyone involved in this setup. Judge Hoffman knew Bumpy Johnson's reputation. Everyone did. Bumpy didn't make empty threats. If he said he had evidence, he had evidence. And if that evidence became public, Hoffman's career was over. "Clear the courtroom," Hoffman ordered again, his voice shaking slightly. The reporters protested. "Your Honor, this is a public proceeding." "Not anymore. Bailiffs, clear this room, now." It took 10 minutes to empty courtroom 4B. The reporters were furious. sensing a story but unable to access it. Stephanie was held in a side room, still in custody, but no longer being dragged out. Only 6 people remained in the courtroom. Judge Hoffman, Prosecutor Patterson, Stephanie's lawyer David Rothstein, Bumpy Johnson, and 2 bailiffs standing by the doors. Hoffman looked at Bumpy with barely concealed hatred. "Say what you have to say, Johnson." Bumpy walked slowly to the front of the courtroom. He carried a leather briefcase which he set on the defendant's table. He opened it and pulled out a folder. "Your Honor, 3 weeks ago, I became aware that this prosecution was not based on legitimate police work, but on fabricated evidence planted by Captain Edward Murphy of the 32nd Precinct at the direction of Dutch Schultz." Patterson scoffed. "This is absurd. You have no proof." Bumpy didn't even look at him. He continued, addressing the judge. "The betting slips and ledgers allegedly found at the barbershop on 135th Street were planted during a raid on October 3rd. I know this because I have affidavits from 2 of Murphy's officers who participated in the raid and are willing to testify that Murphy brought the evidence with him." Bumpy pulled out 2 signed documents and placed them on the judge's bench. Hoffman's hands trembled as he picked them up. These officers also confirmed that Murphy was paid $10,000 by associates of Dutch Schultz to conduct this operation. I have bank records showing the deposits into Murphy's personal account, which I'm sure don't match his police salary. More documents on the bench. Patterson was sweating now. "Your Honor, this is clearly fabricated. Johnson is trying to intimidate this court." The 2 witnesses who testified against Miss St. Clair, Bumpy continued, ignoring Patterson completely, were both facing serious charges, charges that were mysteriously dropped the day after they agreed to testify. I have documentation of those plea agreements, which were never disclosed to the defense as required by law. Rothstein, Stephanie's lawyer, stood up. "Your Honor, if that's true, that's a Brady violation. Exculpatory evidence must be disclosed." "It gets better," Bumpy said. "Judge Hoffman, in the last 18 months, you've received 3 donations to your re-election campaign. $2,000 from a company called Metropolitan Services, LLC, $3,000 from Eastside Holdings, Inc., and $5,000 from an individual named Anthony Morelli. Would you like to know what these 3 donors have in common?" Hoffman's face had gone completely white. "They're all shell companies and associates connected to Dutch Schultz. I have the corporate filings, the bank transfers, everything. You received $10,000 in campaign contributions from the same man who wanted Stephanie St. Clair imprisoned." The silence in that courtroom was absolute. Patterson looked like he might vomit. Hoffman looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Bumpy closed his briefcase. "Now, Your Honor, here's what's going to happen. You're going to vacate Miss St. Clair's conviction. You're going to order her immediate release. You're going to cite new evidence that has come to light. And you're going to do it in such a way that doesn't raise too many questions." "And if I refuse?" Hoffman asked quietly. "Then tomorrow morning every newspaper in New York receives copies of everything I just showed you. The corruption, the bribes, the fabricated evidence, all of it. Your career ends. Patterson's career ends. Murphy goes to prison. And Dutch Schultz loses his protection from the very system he tried to weaponize." Bumpy leaned forward. "But more importantly, Your Honor, if you refuse, people in Harlem will know that you tried to imprison an innocent woman to benefit a white mobster. And I can't guarantee your safety when you drive through certain neighborhoods on your way home. Do you understand what I'm saying?" It wasn't a direct threat. Bumpy was too smart for that. But the implication was crystal clear. Refuse and there would be consequences far beyond professional. Judge Hoffman sat in silence for a full minute. Then he looked at Rothstein. "Counselor, prepare a motion to vacate the conviction based on newly discovered evidence. I'll sign it within the hour." Patterson finally found his voice. "Your Honor, you can't be serious. This is extortion." "This is justice," Bumpy said coldly. "Something you wouldn't recognize if it punched you in the face." Hoffman banged his gavel weakly. "This proceeding is concluded. Miss St. Clair will be released immediately." 30 minutes later, Stephanie St. Clair walked out of that courthouse a free woman. The reporters mobbed her, shouting questions. "Miss St. Clair, what happened in there? Miss St. Clair, why was your conviction vacated?" Stephanie looked back at the courthouse, then at Bumpy standing beside her. She smiled. Justice happened. Real justice. Not the kind they sell in courtrooms, but the kind we make ourselves. Bumpy said nothing. He simply nodded to Stephanie, tipped his hat to the reporters, and walked away. That evening, the story hit every newspaper in New York, but not the real story. The headlines read, "St. Clair conviction overturned on procedural grounds," and "Judge cites new evidence in numbers case." The truth about the corruption, the bribes, the setup, none of that came out. Bumpy had given Hoffman away to save face, and Hoffman had taken it. But in Harlem, everyone knew what really happened. Word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Bumpy Johnson had walked into a courtroom and made a judge back down. He'd freed Queenie without firing a shot, without throwing a punch, just with information and the quiet threat of exposure. 3 days after Stephanie's release, Captain Murphy was quietly transferred to a precinct in Staten Island, effectively ending his career. 6 months later, he resigned from the force entirely. Prosecutor Patterson's political career stalled. He never became the DA he'd aspired to be, and Judge Hoffman, he finished his term but didn't run for re-election. The same month Stephanie was freed, Dutch Schultz tried a different approach. He requested a meeting with Bumpy and Stephanie. Neutral Ground, a restaurant in Midtown. Dutch walked in expecting to negotiate from a position of strength. He walked out understanding that he'd never control Harlem's numbers racket as long as Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson were alive. "You made your point," Dutch said at that meeting. "You got the woman out. Fine, but this war is going to cost all of us money. So here's my offer. You stay in Harlem, I stay out. Your operations are yours. We don't cross paths." Stephanie looked at Bumpy. Bumpy looked at Dutch. "That's not an offer," Bumpy said quietly. "That's you surrendering. Don't dress it up as negotiation." Dutch's face reddened. "I'm trying to be reasonable here." "You tried to put her in prison using cops and judges you paid off," Bumpy said, his voice never rising above conversational level. "You thought because you're white and connected, you could do whatever you wanted in our neighborhood. You learned different, now you want peace, fine, here are the terms. You stay out of Harlem completely. Not just numbers, everything. No collections, no enforcers, no bribes to our cops. Harlem is off limits to you forever." "And if I refuse?" Dutch asked. Bumpy smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. "Then I release everything I have on Judge Hoffman, Captain Murphy, and you. The bribes, the corruption, the whole story. And I make sure it goes to the FBI, not just the newspapers. You'll spend the next 10 years fighting federal charges." Dutch stared at both of them. He was used to intimidating people. He'd built his empire on violence and fear. But sitting across from Stephanie St. Clair and Bumpy Johnson, he felt something he rarely experienced. He felt outmatched. "Fine," Dutch finally said. "Harlem is yours." He stood up and walked out. He would be dead within a year, killed by his own associates, but that's another story. What mattered was that in November 1935, he surrendered territory without a fight because Bumpy Johnson had beaten him using intelligence instead of violence. The story of what happened in that courtroom became legend in Harlem. People told it for decades. The time Queenie was being dragged out laughing, and Bumpy stood up and froze the whole room. The time a black man walked into a white man's courtroom and made the system bend to his will. But here's what most people missed about that day. Bumpy didn't win because he was tough or dangerous, though he was both. He won because he understood how power actually works. Power isn't about who has the biggest gun or the most money. Power is about information. It's about knowing people's secrets. It's about understanding that everyone, even judges and prosecutors, have something to hide. And if you know what they're hiding, you control them. Bumpy had spent 3 weeks investigating not just the case against Stephanie, but everyone involved in building that case. He'd followed money trails. He'd talked to cops who were tired of being Murphy's pawns. He'd dug through public records and private bank accounts. He'd built a file so complete, so damning, that when he laid it in front of Judge Hoffman, there was no defense, no argument, no way out, except surrender. Stephanie St. Clair lived another 34 years after that day. She continued running her numbers operation until the late 1940s, when she finally retired. She never went to prison again. She never faced another trial. And whenever anyone asked her about that day in November 1935, she always said the same thing. Bumpy Johnson saved my life that day. Not because we were friends, though we were. Not because we were partners, though we were that too. He saved me because he understood something most people don't. We're only as strong as our willingness to protect each other. The system wanted to crush me to send a message. Bumpy sent a different message. You can't crush us. Not while we stand together. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, 33 years after that courtroom confrontation. In those 3 decades, he became a legend. The man who controlled Harlem, who negotiated with the Italian mob on equal terms, who protected his community against everyone from corrupt cops to federal agents. But if you asked people who knew him, really knew him, what his greatest moment was, many would point to that day in Courtroom 4B, the day he stood up and made the whole room freeze. Here's the lesson that echoes through time from that moment. You don't fight a rigged system by playing by its rules. You fight it by exposing the fact that it's rigged. Judge Hoffman thought he was untouchable. Prosecutor Patterson thought his position gave him immunity. Captain Murphy thought his badge was a shield. Bumpy Johnson proved that no one is untouchable when the truth comes to light. He didn't need to shoot anyone. He didn't need to burn anything down. He just needed to show powerful men that their secrets weren't as secret as they thought. And in that revelation, in that moment of exposure, the entire corrupt structure crumbled. That's real power. Not violence, not money, not titles or positions. Real power is knowing what others don't want known and being willing to use that knowledge when it matters most. Stephanie St. Clair was being dragged out of a courtroom, laughing at the absurdity of injustice. Bumpy Johnson stood up, and suddenly the laughter didn't seem absurd anymore. It seemed prophetic. Because in the end, the joke was on everyone who thought they could destroy a black woman in Harlem without answering to the people who actually ran that neighborhood. They learned that day what many others would learn over the coming decades. In Harlem, there were laws, and then there was justice. And sometimes, just sometimes, one man standing up was enough to make sure justice won.